Thank you so much, Gail. That was too kind of an introduction. Yeah, as Gail said, my name is Emmett Fitzgerald, and I'm a producer with 99% Invisible. Some of you might be familiar with the show, but if you aren't, it's a documentary podcast all about design and architecture. Although I will say that we interpret design extremely loosely. I recently did a story about the design of European soccer chants, if that gives you any idea. But yes, I want to thank Gil so much. That story that we worked on, Thermal Delight, all about the role that air conditioning played on American architecture, was one of my favorite stories, and our interview was a key part of that. And so, thank you so much for inviting me back here. I was reading through the schedule of events for the meeting earlier this week, and I was so struck by the specificity of the work that you all do. I'm always kind of in awe of academics and just the focus and commitment that it takes to do this kind of research. And I also, when I see events like the ones that happen at a conference like this, I also feel very lucky that I have somehow found a very different job that supports my much less focused generalist brain. While you all are diving deep into things like embodied carbon or thermal comfort standards, I am skimming around on the surface, talking to all kinds of people and just trying to get my hands around things. But I think at best there can be a beautiful symbiosis between our work. I rely on you all to come up with new information and ideas. And I would like to think that I can take some of the work that happens in rooms like this and make it resonate with people outside of the academy. The way that we do that at 99% Invisible is not particularly complicated. There's no real trick other than to lean on the most tried and true form of communication that there is, which is the story. A lot of podcasts these days are just two people talking into microphones, often for what feels like an eternity. Sometimes it's a really smart conversation, sometimes less so. I really have no problem with this style of podcast. I actually primarily listen to them myself, but I think these conversational podcasts have by their nature limited their audience to people who are at least conversant in whatever topic it is the two people are discussing. The audience for a podcast might be history buffs or film nerds, or in my case, fans of the British football club Arsenal. And there are many great energy and environment podcasts out there. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the journalist David Roberts, who writes the fantastic newsletter Volts and hosts the podcast by the same name. I love that podcast. It's one of the podcasts I listen to every week. I think it's very, very important. But it's probably not going to reach that many people who don't already care quite a bit about the green energy transition. What we do at 99% Invisible is a little bit different. Not better, but different. We interview a lot of different people and then stitch their perspectives and experiences together into a narrative. We make stories with characters and tension, beginnings and ends. And I think that this commitment to narrative has the potential to make some of the bigger ideas in our story more digestible to a larger audience of people. People who might not be predisposed to care about peatland carbon sequestration, for example, might be able to access some of those ideas through a story about a specific guy in northern Scotland who watched the wetland landscape around his home get destroyed by a misguided tree planting campaign. That's just a story that I worked on, for example. I've told a lot of different stories over the years. I've made episodes about baseball stadiums and space junk and Instagram architecture. But I'm here with you today because of the podcast that Gail mentioned that I produced 2 years ago, which was all about climate change here in the United States. The show was called Not Built for This, and the idea was really to frame climate change as a massive design problem, that our built environment, really our entire society, was not designed for the climate that we are currently experiencing, let alone the climate 100 years from now. And that in addition to reducing our carbon emissions to zero as quickly as possible, we need to think of trying to adapt our world to better fit the climate that we are actually living in. Adaptation is a funny concept. When I was first getting started in this work 15 years ago, it was almost a dirty word. We needed to focus on stopping our emissions at all costs and to talk of adaptation was almost to admit our failure. But a lot has changed since then. In many respects, we have failed. We haven't done nearly enough to mitigate the crisis, and the consequences of that failure are being felt by people all around the globe, including here in the United States. Climate change has gone from a story about the future to a story about the present, a story about scientific prediction to a story about the messy day-to-day reality that a lot of people are just living through. Not Built for This was an attempt to document this strange moment in geologic time as we transition into a new and terrifying reality that our built environment is just not prepared for. And so my goal here is to take a break from all the research that is down in the important details and zoom out for a second to look at that bigger picture. I'm going to take you through some of the stories and play some tape and introduce you to some of the people and places that we featured in the series. So we started Not Built for This in what felt like a somewhat surprising place, not coastal Florida or Louisiana or drought-stricken Arizona or smoldering Northern California. We started in central Vermont. This is actually the town that I grew up in. This is Montpelier, Vermont. Some of you may have been there. It's a delightful little town, if I do say so myself. It's the smallest state capital in the country by many factors. There's only 8,000 people that live there. My high school had 400 students. And part of what makes Montpelier special is its quaint little downtown. This is Main Street right here. And this walkable commercial center that is really a resource for people all throughout the region. This is a place with a lot of very much smaller towns than 8,000 people. But Montpelier has 2 grocery stores. It has a couple of movie theaters. It has 15 restaurants. This is the big city. Now, downtown Montpelier, like most towns in Vermont, is built along a river. It's actually right at the confluence of 2 branches of the Winooski River. And in the summer of 2023, the rivers did this. This happened in July, and it wasn't even like a named storm. There was no one was expecting this at all. It just kept raining for 24 hours straight. And the rivers that run through Montpelier spilled their banks, and the water filled up with, or the town filled up with more water than at any point since 1927. Now, it's important to note that Montpelier was prone to flooding independent of climate change. But in recent years, towns throughout Vermont have been flooding more every summer. Vermont is not necessarily getting more rain in total, but more of it is coming down all at once, which is a clear signal of climate change. And these annual summer deluges are turning Montpelier's proximity to the river into an existential problem. As they get closer to town, the rivers have been tightly controlled and channelized to enable more development. And they are just not designed to handle this amount of water. The 2023 flood in Montpelier caused a tremendous amount of damage. Nearly all of the businesses downtown flooded that day. And as is often the case in disasters like this, there was a tremendous volunteer effort to get people back on their feet. For months, an army of people did an unreal amount of work. But still, the town was out of commission for months on end. As my parents often complained to me, Montpelier, the state capital, did not have a working post office for well over a year. I wanted to start the series in Montpelier for a couple of reasons. One, it just felt poetic. It was my hometown, and the flood happened just as I was beginning to research this series, and it just seemed too serendipitous to ignore. But 2, it was a place that a lot of people had specifically talked about as being the opposite of vulnerable when it came to climate change. This part of Vermont had been described as a climate haven. And in the course of my reporting, I met people who had actually relocated to Montpelier because of climate change. People who came from California fleeing fires, or from Texas fleeing Hurricane Harvey. And I want to play you a little bit of tape from the series of someone talking to that dynamic. This is the inside of a beloved bookstore in Montpelier called Bear Pond Books. And the voice that you're going to hear is the owner of that store, Rob Casso.
We had gotten a little comfortable and complacent thinking that Vermont was not immune to the ravages of climate change, but just we hadn't had the kind of, large scale event that we see in other parts of the country. So this has been quite an eye-opener for us to see that we are not safe here.
I went back to Montpelier a few weeks after the flood to talk with people about their experiences and how much they were thinking about this in terms of climate change. And Rob and I talked for a long time about what it was like to try to dig out after this devastating storm.
The books, it was painful, and they're heavy when they're really wet too. So it was really hard, nasty work, cleaning the place out because everything was waterlogged and basically anything the water touched had to go. I think the extent of it was not clear to us until we realized that none of our fixtures or furniture was salvageable because it was all tainted by this water, which was not just water, but it was sewage, it was propane, it was oil, it was nasty business.
So this is Rob. He's standing in the store after they'd taken all that stuff out, after they'd done probably a month's worth of work. You can see he's standing on these old floorboards that I talked about in the podcast. The store was famous in town for these extremely loud creaks that these boards would make. They needed to be ripped out, which was a very minor personal tragedy for me. But for the store, it was really a year before they got back on their feet. And what I was struck most with in my conversation with Rob was just how much this whole situation embodied the themes that we were trying to bring out in the podcast. You have this town full of historic businesses and buildings, beloved institutions that was in many ways built for a different world. And now, as the contours of our new world, of our new climate are coming into focus, people like Rob are realizing just how unsuited their infrastructure is for this new reality.
Unfortunately, the cities were built, for a different paradigm, 100 and 200 years ago or whatever. So the question is, your cities are built in a different paradigm. How do you adapt to the brave new world that we're in? That kind of change is very hard for people in northern New England. Things don't change here very much. But I think we're at a moment in our history where things are going to have to change quite a bit. Keeping the state as it was is just not an option at this point.
The aftermath of a disaster is, in some ways, the best time to embrace change, to try to build something new. But it's also, in other ways, the hardest time. After disasters, you get this understandable mentality of restoration, wanting to put things back the way they were, bringing everyone together from the town to support the rebuild. And of course, that makes emotional sense. But I was amazed in Vermont by how many people were processing their experience in the context of climate change. And they weren't just talking about the flood that had happened, they were talking about the next flood that was inevitably going to fill this town up again. And many of them were saying we have to do something differently here. There were a bunch of forums in the aftermath of the flood in Montpelier about what the town could do to become more resilient. There was talk of rebuilding with different materials to be more waterproof. There was talk of moving the businesses up to the second floor or moving furnaces out of the flood-prone basements. There was conversations about floodplain restoration upstream. But there was also a recognition that even all of these hard things were low-hanging fruit. That bigger changes might be needed. Some people talked about slowly migrating the downtown commercial center to the town up the hill to another location where there was open space. There was talk of demolishing my high school, which was built in a floodplain, and moving it to a new, safer location. Montpelier hasn't embraced any of these more radical changes just yet, in part because they're just too expensive, but also I think because that kind of thing is hard emotionally. If you love a place, you have a deep attachment to its history, to the way that it has been. But this is a public library in the town of Johnston, Vermont. Like Montpelier, Johnston has flooded multiple times in recent years, and the library in particular was in a very vulnerable location. It had flooded, I think, 4 times in recent years. But the community didn't want to lose the structure altogether. And so they decided to embrace change and move it. Here is the library jacked up off the ground and put on wheels. There was a team of over 75 construction workers who worked together around the clock for 24 hours to move this structure through the town to a better location on higher ground. And this was like a massive community party in downtown Johnston. The entire town came out with little kids cheering the construction workers along and supporting this dramatic act of climate adaptation. I think This is a video of one of the more remarkable moments in the library's journey when it crossed the bridge that went over the river that had flooded all those years prior, or just a few years prior. And one of the things that I think became clear to me again and again throughout this series was that a lot of things are going to need to move. Buildings, certainly, potentially whole communities, but more fundamentally, there are a lot of people who are going to need to move. Right now, all throughout the country, millions of people are living in areas of really extreme risk, places that were dangerous before you add the risk multiplier that is climate change. And it's important to say that they are usually not doing so entirely by choice. Many of these people were pushed into areas of risk because they were the most affordable places to go. For the series, I spoke with a woman named Susan Dobra and her husband, John Michael, who moved to Butte County in Northern California in the 90s. And they'd originally wanted to settle in the college town of Chico, but it was too expensive. Let's hear a little bit from Susan.
When I first came to Chico, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. It had everything. I mean, I loved the community. The music was insane. I mean, I just loved it. But John Michael and I, at that point, we were raised in Schuyler. We had fallen in love. We decided to try to buy a house together. So we went looking and couldn't find anything in Chico that we could afford. Chico was so much, so out of our reach that when we went up to Paradise and found out that literally the houses were like $100,000 cheaper than in Chico, we started looking up there.
Susan and John Michael bought a little house in the town of Paradise and lived there for over a decade. John Michael was a carpenter and he helped turn the house into what was a very special building for them. It was a small little town built among the trees. It was affordable and quiet, and they loved their life there. Susan would actually commute back down the hill to Chico State, where she happened to be teaching a class on climate change.
I have to admit, the strange thing was that I was thinking of it as a future problem at that time, because it was like in 50 years, this is what's going to happen. And if we don't do this by 2050, it was kind of very oriented towards, what was going to happen down the line. And when that fire hit, all of a sudden it came clear to me, oh my God, we are in it. This is it. This is climate change. This is what's going to happen. It just kind of came roaring up to my back door.
As you probably imagine, Susan and John Michael lost their home in the Camp Fire. And if you listen to the podcast, you can hear a lot more about their story and specifically about the housing journey that they went through in the aftermath. But one of the main takeaways from that episode is the interconnectedness of the housing crisis and the climate crisis. When you don't build enough affordable housing in relatively safe places, more and more people end up in relatively dangerous ones. It's not just wildfire country. In other places, the cheapest land is low-lying and prone to flooding. And while these places of high climate risk might be the most affordable on the surface, the economics are getting more and more dicey. People cannot afford to rebuild multiple times, and the insurance that sometimes, if they're lucky, helps pay for those rebuilds is getting further and further out of reach as the industry begins to price in the climate risks they are all too aware of. With some of these particularly high-risk zones, governments are starting to face some really difficult choices. Fundamentally, they are triage choices about what streets, what neighborhoods, or which entire communities are worth investing in to save. Do we want to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure to protect a risky place, if that's even possible? Or like the library, do we try to move people somewhere safer? The Greenwich Terrace in Louisiana is one such place where this kind of triage decision is playing out. It's an affordable, low-lying neighborhood built in a bend of a highway on a piece of swampy land on the outskirts of Lake Charles, Louisiana. The terrace is theoretically protected from flooding by a series of aging pumps, but their capacity to handle supercharged storms is limited. The region was hit with this incredible parade of hurricanes in 2021, and the terrace flooded 3 times in a single year. Even the oil industry supporting officials in Louisiana were very quick to link this terrible year to climate change. But that was kind of a tough message for residents to hear. I met a woman named Tramika Rankins, who lived in the terrace for many years, and says that it felt like the city and the parish never invested in this working class Black neighborhood. And so when her house flooded 3 times in a row, blaming the situation on climate change felt like a convenient excuse.
I'm just saying that you take your tax dollars and put them where you want to. I'm saying that you did not invest in any kind of infrastructure or drainage structure here in the area that could have maybe offset this. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you did it purposely. What I'm saying is you have maliciously avoided to even help this area. It's a combination of climate change. I'm not saying that that does not play a factor in it, but what you allocating your dollars to care for and do has a lot to do with what's happened here.
In the end, the state of Louisiana decided to step in and offer residents like Tramika a buyout. Basically, they would pay her to move out of her house and into a new one with lower flood risk. Then they demolished the properties. And little by little, the most flood-prone parts of the terrace are being turned back to nature. This is a small example of the idea of managed retreat. And in many ways, I think this is really good. This is the kind of forward-thinking adaptation that we need. We need to be using the resources of the government to help vulnerable people get out of harm's way. But it also raises some really challenging questions about who is going to get what kind of help as this crisis progresses. Tramika is being asked to move at the same time that governments are spending millions of dollars to protect beachfront property along the coast. This is a picture of a coastal armament project in South Carolina run by the Army Corps of Engineers. They're trying to prevent these beach houses from getting swallowed by the sea for a few more decades. I want to play a clip from one of the researchers who helped shape my thinking on these issues. Her name is Anna Weber, and she works for the Natural Resources Defense Council and works specifically on climate adaptation.
A lot of this is driven by economics. It is more, quote unquote, worth it to protect areas of higher value in a financial sense. And that means that on the flip side, areas of quote unquote lower value in a financial sense are often left out. They're not put behind the wall. They're not protected by the structural projects.
Low-income communities and communities of color are much more likely to be offered a buyout as a solution to their flooding problems. And it's easy to understand why this happens. If you're planning a managed retreat buyout program, it makes sense that you would try to give the opportunity to relocate out of harm's way to the people who need that help the most.
Communities of color, lower income communities are much more likely to be faced with the impacts of chronic flooding. And so when buyouts are proposed, it makes sense that these communities might be at the top of the list. But it also means that these communities are effectively being targeted, not in a malicious way, but they are being prioritized for relocation. These are communities that have contributed the least to the problem. These are communities that are facing cumulative impacts, probably of lots of other kinds of challenges, environmental pollution, disinvestment in infrastructure, and now they're being told to relocate. That's a huge problem from a justice standpoint.
Anna is in a really strange position. In many ways, she's the chief critic of buyout programs, but she also knows better than anyone that we are going to need so many more of them in the years to come. Climate change will only increase the number of people living in dangerous flood zones. People all throughout the country will need to retreat, and they will need help doing so. And at least right now, the buyout is basically the only way we know how to help them.
This completely insufficient tool of a home buyout is the best and perhaps only real tool that we have right now to help people move out of harm's way. I like to clarify when I talk to people about home buyouts, I'm not advocating for buyouts. People are taking a buyout because it's their last option. It's their last, least bad option.
I really like that phrase, the last least bad option, because I think it really sums up what climate adaptation work is often all about. It speaks to the impossible predicament that many people, including many policymakers, find themselves in. These are not win-win scenarios. People are going to lose. I think it is the job of people with power and influence to do everything they can to limit those losses. And part of that means fighting for every 100th degree of warming that we can prevent. The final episode of our story was about Phoenix, Arizona. As many of you probably know, Phoenix is becoming almost unbearably hot in recent summers. In the summer of 2023, temperature got above 110 degrees for more than 30 days in a row. As we were in the process of making this series, I got kind of obsessed with this little local news story about how temperatures were causing the mighty saguaro cactus to keel over in the heat. These spiky giants are perfectly adapted to life in the desert, and yet all throughout the city, they were coming down left and right, crushing people's cars. And for obvious reasons, this got me thinking not about cactuses, but about us. If the saguaro couldn't take the heat, what did that mean for humans? The final story of Not Built for This was about the biological limits of adaptation. The impact of climate disasters are often assessed in terms of property. We talk about millions of dollars of damage. But in places like Phoenix, climate change is wreaking havoc on people's bodies. Heat kills more people every year than any other weather event. The best estimate of the annual death toll is around 500,000 people globally. In Phoenix, many of the victims of extreme heat are unhoused people who are living much of their lives fully exposed to the sun. My editor, Delaney Hall, spoke with a woman named Bunny who was living on the streets of Phoenix.
All we can do is try to find a shady spot to sit if the cops don't run us out or security people don't run us out. You know, most times we're stuck out in the sun. It really sucks because there's nowhere out there to really cool down. It's hot, nasty, muggy, dirty, filthy, just all around bad news.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because, you know, I feel like Arizona has this thing where people come because they love the sun and they love the life here. Have you found that? Or
Yeah, I've found a few people that like it, yeah. But there's very few of them that like it whenever it hits 120, 125, you know. Then they want to scurry inside where their air conditioning is, you know. We're out here 24/7. They get to go home in their nice, comfortable air conditioners.
Access to air conditioning has become a matter of life and death in Phoenix. For this story, we spoke with Dr. Jeffrey Komp, an ER physician in Phoenix. When we spoke with him, heat-related deaths were up 52% from the previous year. An estimated 645 people had died from heat in Phoenix in 2023, and almost 300 of them were unhoused. Dr. Komp says people were arriving at the ER in truly mind-boggling conditions.
Our thermometers top out at 109. And personally, I've had multiple patients that have come in that have maxed out our thermometers. So I honestly don't know what we call it Tmax or maximum temperature has been for patients. But we've had people that come in incredibly, incredibly, incredibly hot. It's sad because this is an absolutely preventable disease. I mean, different people are affected based on different risk factors. But for the most part, if we can get someone out of the heat, we can prevent a lot of death.
One of my main takeaways from this project was just that climate adaptation work is so much more far-reaching than we think. ER docs in Phoenix are doing climate adaptation work, and so are the caseworkers who are trying to get people off the streets and into air-conditioned homes. But as many of you probably know better than me, there are problems with over-relying on air conditioning to keep people safe. For one, it's contributing massively to the climate problem in the first place. But air conditioning is also brittle and prone to breaking down. AC puts a lot of stress on the electrical grid. And a study came out a few years back that attempted to map out what it would look like if you had a blackout in Phoenix during a major heat wave. The study predicted that half the city's population, nearly 800,000 people, would need emergency room care. Phoenix is taking this crisis very seriously. They appointed a heat czar and have earmarked a lot of money for tree planting and other efforts to increase shade throughout the city. They're trying to build more cooling centers. But if there was a takeaway from our story about extreme heat, it's that there are limits to our ability to adapt, and that adaptation gets exponentially harder the hotter the atmosphere gets. And so my final message here is that climate change mitigation and adaptation cannot be mutually exclusive. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can build a more resilient world and a carbon-free world at the same time. In fact, we have to. We need to stop the forces that are irrevocably changing our planet, and at the same time be honest about the degree to which our planet has already been changed, and try our best to build for the world that we are actually living in. That means designing LEED Platinum buildings with innovative new materials, and it also means thinking hard about where we build and how we build to help people survive what's coming. This is a moment of almost incomprehensible change. A lot of that change is really bad, but our chance of thriving in the decades to come is to not resist that change, but to go with it. The world is going to look a lot different in 50 years, whether we like it or not. We can't fight that fact. I hate to rely on an automobile metaphor here for this, but we have to turn into the skid. I just want to end on this picture of Northfield, Vermont, which is not far from my hometown. It was created through a buyout program like the one I talked about in Lake Charles. There were buildings here once, but that didn't make sense anymore. And now the landscape has been transformed to meet the moment. It's a beautiful park that can hold water during flood events, and the rest of the time just be a really lovely green space for people to enjoy. After what I hope hasn't been too depressing of a talk, I will end on that relatively pleasant image. Thank you all for having me.